in the frozen silence of a winter night in 1235. The great stone halls of a French castle trembled with a cry not meant for celebration, but for despair. It was not the clash of knights on a battlefield, nor the dying moan of a soldier in a crusade. It was the voice of Princess Isabella of Angoulême, barely 14 years old, forced into a bed she did not choose, with a man twice her age waiting in the shadows. Her scream echoed through the torch-lit corridors, sending shivers through the servants who dared not intervene. What took place that night was no accident of marriage, but the brutal unveiling of a hidden tradition, one that every medieval princess knew awaited her. A ritual whispered about in cloisters, erased from chronicles, and buried under 600 years of silence. To the world, these weddings were alliances sealed with holy blessings, but behind closed doors they were cages of obedience, humiliation, and fear. The first night was not a celebration of love, but a test of submission, crafted by kings, priests, and dynasties. And for centuries, young brides of royal blood paid the price in silence, their cries censored from history's pages. The Middle Ages were an age of iron and prayer, of stone castles and burning cathedrals, of knights who thundered into battle under banners marked with lions, crosses, and lilies. But behind the clash of steel and the songs of troubadours, there was another world, quieter, darker, hidden behind veils of silk and Latin scripture. It was the world of the medieval princess. To the peasants who gazed up at the towers of royal castles, a princess seemed the very embodiment of splendor, draped in ermine, crowned with jewels, her life a fairy tale sung by minstrels in the market square. Yet behind the tapestries and candlelight, her existence was a prison built of duty. For in medieval Europe, a princess was not a daughter in the ordinary sense. She was a treaty written in flesh, a pawn in the grand game of dynasties, destined from birth to be bartered away like land or coin. From France to England, from Castile to the Holy Roman Empire, the daughters of kings were raised not for freedom, but for sacrifice. Their childhoods were measured in lessons, not laughter. At the age when peasant children chased geese through village fields, royal girls were already cloistered within stone halls, learning the rigid codes of silence, obedience, and piety. They studied prayers in Latin, memorized the Psalms of David, and practiced endless rituals of courtesy. Their every movement, from the way they folded their hands to the angle of their gaze, was designed to please a court, a husband, and a god who seemed less like a savior than a jailer. But the most terrifying fate awaited them when they came of age. For in the medieval imagination, marriage was not the culmination of love, but the enforcement of duty. The Church proclaimed that a woman's highest calling was to obey her husband, as the Church obeys Christ. And so, when the time came, princesses were handed over to men they barely knew, often men old enough to be their fathers or even their grandfathers, warriors hardened by campaigns in Italy, Spain, or the Crusades. These unions were rarely blessings. They were contracts, sealed in stone by bishops and kings, sanctified at altars, but born in fear. Unlike noblewomen of lesser rank, who sometimes negotiated marriages within their families, princesses were bound by politics of an unforgiving scale. Their betrothals were arranged not for affection, but for empires. When Eleanor of Aquitaine was married at 15, she did not walk into love but into a chain that bound together the kingdoms of France and Aquitaine. When Margaret of Scotland was betrothed to the King of Norway, her hand was not her own. It was the price of peace between two warring nations. Every royal girl grew up knowing this truth. Her wedding night would not be her own. It would be the night her body became a signature, her silence the ink with which treaties were signed. And yet, the horror lay not only in the political transaction, but in the rituals that surrounded it. Centuries of church law and custom had built a terrifying choreography, transforming the wedding night into a test of purity and obedience. Priests and confessors would lecture the young bride on her duty, to endure without resistance, to accept pain as holy, to remain silent as a form of sanctity. Some were even told that suffering in silence would bring them closer to the Virgin Mary, the eternal symbol of sacrifice. These teachings were not confined to dusty manuscripts. They were drilled into the minds of girls barely old enough to understand them. In monasteries and convent schools, future brides practiced kneeling in cold chapels for hours, fasting until their bodies trembled, learning to say yes in whispers when their hearts screamed no. The castle itself became a training ground for submission. Governesses, stern women chosen by queens and abbots, oversaw their every breath. They corrected posture with rods, silenced questions with punishments, and replaced curiosity with prayers. A princess who resisted was chastised as prideful. A princess who wept was lectured on humility. Slowly, a bright child became a shadow, obedient, graceful, and silent. But even that was only the beginning. For long before the marriage ceremony, whispers of the prima nocta, the dreaded first night, haunted these girls. Though historians debate whether the rite of the first night was ever truly law, what cannot be denied is that the first wedding night of a princess was always a spectacle of fear. It was the night she was expected to prove her chastity, her obedience, her very worth. Sheets were sometimes inspected for blood. Servants stood outside the door to bear witness to the cries within, and failure, whether real or imagined, could doom not only her, but her entire family's political standing. In truth, the terror of the medieval princess was born from the union of two tyrannies, the tyranny of kings who saw their daughters as bargaining chips, and the tyranny of a church that sanctified obedience as holiness. Together, they created a ritual in which fear replaced joy and silence became survival. Princess Isabella of England, married at 13 to Emperor Frederick II, is said to have fainted repeatedly before her wedding night, so overcome with dread that she had to be carried into the chamber. Chroniclers softened the tale, calling her delicate, but her attendants, in letters that survived centuries later, described it plainly. She was terrified, and she was not alone. From English castles to Spanish fortresses, from German strongholds to Italian palaces, royal daughters entered marriage chambers as trembling sacrifices. Their cries, like Isabella's, echoed through stone halls, only to be silenced in chronicles written by monks who praised the grandeur of kings, but erased the suffering of queens. Thus, behind the splendor of medieval courts lay a darker reality, one censored for 600 years. The first wedding night of a princess was not a story of romance, but of ritualized fear, crafted to bind her body and soul to a destiny she never chose. To understand why medieval princesses feared their wedding night, we must look beyond the stone walls of castles and into the towering cathedrals that defined their world. In medieval Europe, the church was not only the keeper of souls, but the architect of society itself. Kings bowed to popes, lords swore oaths on relics, and ordinary peasants measured their lives by the tolling of church bells. For a royal daughter, the church was both her cradle and her cage. From the moment of birth, a princess's life was wrapped in rituals of sanctity. She was baptized in marble basins, cradled in linen embroidered with psalms, and handed over to confessors before she could even speak. Her first words were guided by priests, her first steps corrected by governesses chosen by abbots, and her first lessons were not in freedom but in obedience. Scripture, quoted endlessly by tutors, reminded her of St. Paul's command, "Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord." By the 12th and 13th centuries, monasteries and cathedral schools produced endless handbooks for noblewomen. These texts, written by bishops and monks, were cloaked in the language of holiness, but functioned as tools of submission. One popular guide, De Institutione Feminae Nobili, instructed young brides to speak only when spoken to welcome suffering as Christ welcomed the cross, and to endure the wedding night in silence, lest the devil find pride in your resistance. Priests and confessors reinforced these lessons in weekly sessions. A princess would kneel before a spiritual father and recite the duties of a wife, to obey without hesitation, to preserve silence, to never deny her husband, and to accept that her body belonged not to her, but to the union sanctified by God. Even private fear was labeled a sin. If she trembled at the thought of her wedding night, she was told it was pride. If she wept, she was told it was disobedience. Before marriage, many princesses were educated in convents. These cloisters, places of prayer and learning, became laboratories of obedience. Girls as young as 7 were made to fast for entire days, learning to control hunger as practice for controlling fear. They were taught to kneel on cold stone floors until their knees bled, reminded that pain was purifying, that silence was divine. A princess who asked questions was chastised with verses. A princess who resisted was denied meals. Every act of curiosity was framed as sin. Every tear was rebranded as weakness. Slowly, the will of a royal daughter was bent, not through swords or whips, but through the endless weight of prayer, ritual, and humiliation. The final stage of this conditioning came in the weeks before the wedding itself. Priests delivered sermons that sounded less like blessings and more like warnings. They told the trembling bride that her husband was her earthly lord, chosen by God. They told her that to refuse him was to defy heaven itself. Some were even reminded of the punishments of Eve, that disobedience had brought sin into the world, and that obedience in marriage was her way of repaying that ancient debt. One sermon, preserved in the archives of Rouen Cathedral, instructed a young princess of Normandy, "The first night is thy crucifixion. Bear it as Christ bore his. Resist not, speak not, for silence is the mark of the holy bride." These words did not prepare a girl for joy. They prepared her for surrender. Beyond prayer and sermons, the Church also sanctioned humiliating rituals to ensure compliance. In some regions, a princess was required to undergo a trial of purity. This could mean public blessings in which her virginity was declared before lords and bishops, or humiliating inspections of her body by matrons appointed by the Church. If she cried, it was taken as guilt. If she resisted, it was labeled sin. On the night of the marriage, the Church's shadow loomed even in the bridal chamber. Bishops often blessed the bed itself, sprinkling holy water over sheets and pillows, not for the comfort of the bride, but to sanctify the act that would follow. Servants sometimes remained just outside the door, waiting to confirm the consummation through blood-stained sheets. Failure to produce proof could lead to annulments, scandals, or worse, accusations of witchcraft or fraud. Official chronicles never spoke of these terrors. Monks who wrote histories of kings recorded coronations, battles, and treaties, but not the sobs of frightened brides. The suffering of women was erased, their voices buried under illuminated manuscripts praising God's order. Yet hidden letters, private diaries, and fragments of testimony reveal the truth. Princesses were terrified, conditioned by faith to accept fear as destiny. In one letter from the 14th century, Princess Blanche of Navarre confessed to her confessor that she had prayed for death rather than endure her wedding night. Her plea was not met with comfort, but with rebuke. To desire death is sin. To endure is holy. It is easy to imagine the Church only as an oppressor, but the truth was more complex. For some women, cloisters offered refuge from unwanted marriages. For a few, pious reputations gave them leverage in court politics. But for the vast majority, faith was not a shield, but a chain. It sanctified their silence, it baptized their obedience, and it turned their wedding night into a ritual of dread. The irony is stark. The same Church that crowned kings and sanctified thrones also crushed the spirits of the daughters it claimed to protect. By transforming obedience into holiness and silence into virtue, it ensured that generation after generation of princesses walked to their wedding chambers trembling, not with joy, but with fear. 3 months before her wedding, a medieval princess's life changed forever. The day her betrothal was announced, bells rang in cathedrals, minstrels sang in marketplaces, and nobles celebrated with banquets. But inside the walls of her chamber, the air grew colder. For the girl at the center of this celebration, the announcement was not joy, but the beginning of fear. From that moment she entered what chroniclers politely called the bridal preparation. To outsiders, this sounded like a period of lessons in etiquette, prayer, and beauty. But hidden behind stone doors, it was a system of psychological and physical conditioning, a ritual not to honor the princess, but to break her spirit before she entered her husband's bed. The overseers of this process were not gentle companions. They were governesses, abbesses, and older noblewomen chosen for their severity. Some had endured the same rituals in their youth and now passed them on with grim efficiency. Their task was simple: transform a royal daughter into a vessel of obedience. The training began with posture and silence. The princess was taught to walk slowly, her eyes lowered, her hands folded neatly before her. Any sign of hesitation, any flicker of independence, was punished. A slap across the face, hours of kneeling on cold stone floors, or enforced fasting until hunger dulled her resistance. These were the tools of discipline. She was drilled in countless bows and gestures of submission. Each had its meaning, one for greeting her husband, one for serving him, another for receiving commands in silence. Her body was reshaped into a language of obedience, each movement a surrender rehearsed until it became instinct. More cruel than the control of her body was the control of her voice. A princess might have once recited poetry, debated philosophy with tutors, or sung hymns in the chapel. But as marriage approached, her words were stripped away. She was given a list of permitted phrases, often no more than a few dozen, expressions of gratitude, apologies, or meek requests. Anything beyond these questions, refusals, personal thoughts, was forbidden. A single slip brought punishment, hours in silence, sometimes isolation in dark rooms called cubicula poenitentiae, chambers of penance. This was no accident. By narrowing her speech, the overseers narrowed her world. Slowly, the princess learned that words were dangerous, that silence was survival. The most terrifying part of her training came in the form of noctis imitatio, the imitation of the night. In secret chambers of the castle, rooms were prepared to mimic the bridal chamber. Here, under the watch of matrons and sometimes priests, the princess was forced to rehearse her wedding night. Wax mannequins or carved wooden figures were dressed as grooms. The young bride was instructed to kneel, to disrobe in ritual gestures, to lie upon the bed without resistance. Every hesitation was recorded, every tear noted. If she trembled, the session was repeated. If she resisted, the punishment grew harsher. Sometimes, servants or attendants played the role of the husband, looming over her to instill fear. These rehearsals were not merely cruel, they were designed to condition. By the time the true night arrived, the princess's terror had already been rehearsed into obedience. Twice each week, the princess was subjected to public humiliation within the female court. She was ordered to serve her governesses, to wash their feet, to brush their hair, to feed them by hand. For a daughter of kings, raised to embody dignity, this was deliberate degradation. The lesson was clear: pride must die before marriage. Some chronicles record that royal brides wept openly during these rituals, their tears mocked as weakness. Others fainted under the strain of fasting and fear, only to be revived and sent back to their tasks. There was no escape, no mercy. Food, clothing, and even prayer were transformed into instruments of control. Meals were restricted to simple bread, bitter herbs, and watered wine, meant to weaken the body and dull the will. On some days, she was given mixtures of poppy seeds or valerian root, subtle sedatives masked as holy tonics. Her clothing was altered to restrict her freedom. Heavy gowns stitched with gold weighed her down, while shoes with thick soles slowed her steps. Even her bridal dress, fitted in these months, was designed less as a garment of honor and more as a cage. Tight sleeves, heavy veils, and layers that left her breathless. Prayer itself was weaponized. 5 times a day, she was commanded to kneel and repeat specially written prayers of obedience, invocations that praised silence, submission, and surrender. What should have been her personal link to God was turned into another chain binding her to duty. As weeks turned into months, the transformation was stark. The once lively child who played music and studied languages became a pale shadow of herself. Chroniclers wrote that such brides became statues of silence, their eyes lowered, their voices faint, their laughter gone. In letters that survive from the court of Aragon, one attendant described Princess Maria of Castile before her wedding. She no longer speaks of poetry, nor of music. Her lips tremble when the matrons approach her, and when she prays, her eyes are empty, as though she seeks not God but escape. The goal was not to prepare her for joy, but to erase her will. By the time her wedding day arrived, she was no longer a princess in spirit, she was an offering, sculpted for sacrifice. To the outside world, these months were celebrated with pageantry. Songs, processions, and gifts were sent to the bride as symbols of joy. But inside the castle, the true ceremony was one of shadows. The bridal preparation was a theater of fear, staged to ensure that when the marriage night came, the princess would not resist. Her voice had been silenced, her pride broken, her body conditioned to obedience. She walked not into marriage, but into submission, rehearsed so thoroughly that it felt inevitable. Thus, the fear of medieval princesses was not born on their wedding night alone. It was cultivated long before in rituals that blurred the line between religion and cruelty, tradition and torment. By the time the candles were lit in the nuptial chamber, the girl who entered was already broken, her cries rehearsed, her silence sanctified. The wedding day of a medieval princess was a spectacle the world admired. From dawn to dusk, towns erupted in celebration. Bells pealed from cathedrals, streets filled with parades, jugglers and troubadours entertained crowds, and banquets overflowed with roasted boar, wine, and sugared fruits. To peasants, it seemed a vision of heaven itself, God's blessing made visible through earthly splendor. But for the princess, clothed in heavy brocade and crowned with jewels that cut into her scalp, the day was not joy. It was the slow tightening of chains. Every cheer in the marketplace, every hymn sung in the chapel, was a reminder that her fate was sealed. She knew what awaited her when the candles dimmed, when the last minstrel's song faded, when the chamber doors closed. As night fell, the most dreaded ritual began, the procession to the bridal chamber. Servants lined the corridors with torches, nobles whispered prayers, and bishops sprinkled holy water along the path. The princess, her steps slowed by layers of fabric, was escorted by matrons and priests to a room prepared for both sanctity and submission. This chamber, often called the Camera Nuptialis, was not a sanctuary but a stage. Its walls were hung with tapestries depicting biblical brides, Rebecca at the well, Sarah obeying Abraham, Mary in her humility, each woven to remind the princess of her duty. At the foot of the bed stood a crucifix, illuminated by candles, as if Christ himself were watching to ensure obedience. Sometimes the ritual went further. In parts of France and the Holy Roman Empire, members of the court were allowed to escort the bride and groom into the chamber, standing by until the first act of intimacy began. Even if they did not stay, their presence at the threshold was enough to remind the young bride her body was not her own, but a matter of state, witnessed and judged. In many courts, the consummation was not left private. Sheets were laid out, and matrons were ordered to collect them by morning to prove the bride's virginity. A stain of blood was treated as proof of honor. Its absence could destroy alliances. Chroniclers tell of brides who were inspected immediately after the act, their bodies examined by older women under the guise of ensuring purity. The terror of this inspection weighed heavily on the princess even before the night began. Some were known to injure themselves deliberately to ensure the expected blood, fearing the consequences if they failed. For them, the act was not only about enduring pain, but about surviving the scrutiny of an entire court. While the princess had spent months being broken into silence, her husband was often trained in the opposite. Lords and knights, coached by confessors and advisors, were instructed to assert dominance from the first night. Manuals advised them to instill fear rather than tenderness, to remind their young brides that resistance was sinful. Some were told to treat the chamber as they would a battlefield, to conquer, not to comfort. Thus, the imbalance was complete. The girl entered the chamber stripped of will, while the man entered armed with authority. What followed was not a union of love, but an act of conquest. When the doors closed and the room fell silent, the true terror began. The princess, trembling in heavy garments, was often ordered to kneel before her husband, to offer prayers for obedience, and to undress under his command. Her body, already weakened by fasting and training, shook with fear. Chroniclers avoided describing what happened next, but private letters and rare testimonies tell us enough. For many, the first night was an ordeal of pain. The combination of youth, fear, and lack of preparation left brides traumatized. Physicians recorded fainting, hemorrhaging, and what they called melancholia virginalis, the sickness of the virgin bride, a term that masked psychological collapse. Witnesses described brides who screamed until their voices broke, only to be silenced with threats of shame or divine punishment. Others withdrew completely, their eyes fixed on the crucifix above the bed, whispering prayers as if trying to escape into another world. What happened in that chamber rarely stayed there. If the consummation was judged successful, the alliance was secure, and the princess's suffering was dismissed as a private matter. But if doubts arose, if the sheets showed no blood, if rumors spread of resistance, the consequences were dire. In England, a queen's virginity could determine the legitimacy of heirs. In Spain, it could affect alliances with the Church. In France, it could mean annulment, disgrace, or exile. The fate of entire kingdoms rested on the body of a trembling girl. Her silence weighed more heavily than her screams. Some husbands, fearing political failure, forced the act again and again until proof was produced. Others humiliated their wives publicly, accusing them of impurity, while bishops and nobles deliberated over their fates as though they were criminals. The aftermath of the first night was often more haunting than the act itself. Brides who survived it rarely spoke of what had happened. Those who did were dismissed as hysterical or sinful. Their tears were explained away as weakness, their trembling as modesty. But the truth lived on in private letters, in whispers carried by ladies, in waiting, in fragments of testimony buried in archives. Princess Joan of England, married at 12 to the King of Sicily, wrote in a letter to her mother, "I prayed for the angels to take me away, but they did not. I woke in the morning broken, though no one would see." Her letter was hidden for centuries, dismissed as exaggeration. Yet it echoes countless unrecorded cries, censored by history, but carved into the souls of the women who endured them. In the official chronicles, the first night was never tragedy. It was always recorded as triumph. Monks wrote of alliances sealed, of dynasties united, of God's blessing on new unions. No one mentioned the trembling hands, the muffled sobs, the hollow eyes of the bride. Her pain was not history. It was erased, replaced by the pride of kings. Thus, the wedding night became a paradox, to the world, a victory, to the princess, a defeat. It was the moment her life ceased to be her own, the moment her body became the property of a husband and a dynasty, the moment her voice was silenced more completely than ever before. And so, for 600 years, this ritual remained hidden in shadows, erased by priests, softened by chroniclers, but remembered in whispers. It was not a celebration of love. It was a crucible of fear, endured in silence by generations of women whose names we remember only in chronicles that never told their truth. The morning after the wedding night, the world celebrated. Bells rang in cathedrals, priests declared the union holy, and messengers carried news of dynastic triumphs across kingdoms. But behind the stone walls of castles, the princess herself was left in silence, her body bruised, her spirit hollowed, her voice muted. What had been presented to the world as a sacred triumph was, for her, the beginning of a lifetime of quiet suffering. Medieval physicians had no language for trauma, no vocabulary to describe the invisible wounds carved into the minds of young brides. Instead, they cloaked their observations in medical terms that disguised reality. Some called it melancholia virginalis, the melancholy of virgins. Others wrote of morbus pudoris, the sickness of modesty. Symptoms included fainting at the sight of men, uncontrollable weeping, refusal to eat, mutism, and trembling. We recognize these today as signs of deep psychological trauma, but in their time they were treated as curiosities, as female weakness, as mysteries of nature rather than consequences of cruelty. Treatments ranged from herbal tonics of valerian and rue to exorcisms meant to drive out spirits of resistance. None addressed the truth that these young women were victims of a system designed to break them. The scars of the first night followed princesses throughout their lives. Some withdrew into silence, speaking only when required, their voices reduced to whispers. Others developed what we would call today panic disorders, fainting in the presence of men, unable to bear the touch of even their husbands. Many bore children, fulfilling their dynastic duties, but lived without joy in motherhood. Letters and chronicles reveal women who avoided their infants, not out of cruelty, but because every cradle reminded them of the night their own lives had been stolen. For others, the trauma turned into illness. Royal courts recorded queens who wasted away in their 20s, their bodies failing under what doctors described as fevers of the heart. Some lived for decades, but as shells of who they once were, ornaments of the court, draped in silks but stripped of spirit. The suffering of these women rarely entered the official record. Chroniclers, most of them monks and priests, wrote about wars, treaties, and coronations, but not about tears in the bridal chamber. When queens or princesses disappeared into silence, the chronicles described them as pious, humble, or modest. Virtues praised by the church, but, in truth, often signs of broken spirits. Yet, fragments survive. In hidden letters, private confessions, and testimonies preserved in family archives, we find glimpses of their reality. A letter from Princess Margaret of Hungary, written to a nun she trusted, confessed, "They called it holy, but I felt only terror. I prayed for death each night, but the angels turned their faces." An account from the attendants of Isabella of France described how she often collapsed at the sight of her husband, later remembered as a queen of strength, yet carrying hidden scars from her earliest years. Anonymous chronicles from convents recorded young brides sent away in secrecy after refusing consummation, their names erased to protect dynasties. These voices were rare, fragile, and often censored. Yet together, they whisper the truth that official history tried to silence. Not all princesses endured in silence. Some tried to resist, often at great cost. A few feigned illness or madness to avoid repeated consummation. Others fled to convents, claiming religious devotion, though their true motive was escape. There are accounts of young brides throwing themselves into rivers or from castle towers, acts later rewritten as accidents or suicides of despair. Even so, sparks of defiance survived. In the 14th century, Princess Joanna of Naples openly petitioned the Pope for annulment, citing cruelty on her wedding night. Though her case was rare and dangerous, it revealed a crack in the facade of silence. For most, however, defiance was impossible. The weight of kings, priests, and dynasties ensured that submission was the only path. What the world saw was not trauma, but pageantry. Princesses appeared at feasts, bore heirs, and stood beside kings at coronations. Their silence was praised as virtue, their fragility described as grace. The very symptoms of their suffering were rebranded as the qualities of a perfect queen. And so, the political mask was complete. Behind every alliance celebrated in Europe, between England and France, Castile and Aragon, the Empire and the Papacy, stood a young bride whose cries were silenced, her fear baptized as holiness, her suffering erased for the sake of kingdoms. For 600 years, these truths remained hidden. Chroniclers erased them, priests justified them, and dynasties depended on the silence. Only in scattered letters, convent archives, and forgotten family records do we glimpse the terror that lay behind the glittering veil of medieval marriage. The censorship was deliberate. To admit the truth would have been to admit that the very foundations of dynasties were built not only on treaties and battles, but on the broken bodies of their daughters. It would have revealed that the supposed sanctity of Christian marriage was, at its core, a ritual of control and fear. Today, we look back at medieval princesses as figures of romance, their lives woven into fairy tales of knights and castles. But the truth is darker. Their stories are warnings, proof that power without compassion consumes even its own blood. The cry of a princess on her wedding night was not an accident of history. It was the price exacted by kings and priests who placed politics above humanity. And while history censored their voices, fragments of their suffering have survived, echoing across the centuries. If the story of one princess shatters the illusion of medieval romance, what of the dozens, perhaps hundreds, who endured the same fate? How many voices remain buried in convent vaults, in chronicles softened by lies, in records burned to protect the pride of kings? The silence of 6 centuries is not merely absence, it is evidence. It reminds us that history is often written by the powerful, while the cries of the powerless are erased. And yet, by unearthing these fragments, by retelling these censored truths, we can finally hear the echoes of those voices. Their fear was not weakness, it was testimony. Their silence was not virtue, it was survival. Their suffering was not fate, it was the price of dynasties built on their bodies. And so, when we ask why medieval princesses feared their first wedding night, we must answer not with fairy tales, but with the truth, because it was never a night of love, but a ritual of terror, sanctified by faith, demanded by politics, and censored by history for 600 years. If this story shook you, make sure to like this video so the truth reaches more people. Subscribe to our channel. We have many more hidden stories from history waiting to be uncovered. And in the comments, tell us, where are you watching from? Also, let us know which queen or princess's story you want us to cover next.